Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today as we consider the collateral effects of economic sanctions, a tool that is increasingly being used by the United States government to further foreign policy and national security objectives. Economic sanctions are coercive economic measures. Examples include trade embargoes, restrictions on exports or imports, denial of foreign assistance, loans and investments, blocking of foreign assets under the United States jurisdiction, and prohibitions on economic transactions that involve U.S. citizens or businesses. Congress often mandates economic sanctions, and both Democratic and Republican administrations have used them against foreign actors to try to deter a wide range of behaviors, including human rights violations, the undermining of democracy, corruption, and terrorism. Some sanctions are multilateral, including those imposed by the United Nations Security Council, but many, if not most, are unilateral. As of October 2021, when the Department of Treasury completed its sanctions review, the U.S. government had sanctions in force on more than 9,400 individuals and entities in relation to more than 20 countries. As the use of sanctions has increased, so have the reports of their collateral damage. Highly credible human rights and humanitarian organizations and the UN itself have warned about the negative consequences of far-reaching sanctions in countries like Venezuela, Syria, Afghanistan, and Iran, even as the objectives behind the sanctions have failed to be achieved. I introduced the original Magnitsky sanctions bill in the House back in 2010 and have long been a strong supporter of imposing targeted sanctions on specific individuals when there is credible information of their direct responsibility for serious human rights abuses or major corruption. For just as long, I've strongly opposed comprehensive sanctions that impose broad restrictions on trade and economic activity with a country because their effects are felt mostly by the civilian population. I believe the record shows that these end up being a form of collective punishment that fails to achieve anything except punishing people into ever deepening misery and fueling anti-American sentiment. Now, these kinds of sanctions often feel to me like they're driven more by vengeance than by strategy. But increasingly, we are receiving reports that even targeted sanctions can have serious negative collateral effects. Targeted sanctions on a central bank, for example, or on an oil company that generates most of the country's export earnings can have consequences that are almost as devastating as an indiscriminate trade embargo. So the purpose of today's hearing is to review what is known about how to design and implement sanctions in order to make sure that they are as effective as possible and to try to avoid the worst collateral effects. As we will hear from our witnesses, those collateral effects take many forms. Sanctions can exacerbate a humanitarian crisis, as we're seeing in Afghanistan, even when mitigating steps are taken. They can end up strengthening illicit economies and benefiting criminal organizations, as we see in Venezuela. Counterterrorism sanctions can directly undermine fundamental human rights and impede diplomacy and peace building. The costs of compliance with sanctions and the legal risks can lead private sector and civil society actors to stop working in a country altogether, even though their services may be desperately needed. Sanctions can accelerate cooperation amongst U.S. adversaries, and there's a growing concern that they may eventually undermine the use of the dollar as a reserve currency. So it is imperative to get sanctions right if we want to preserve them as an effective, legitimate foreign policy tool. It is even more important to get them right if we want to live up to our ethical values and human rights commitments. We have with us a distinguished panel of witnesses who have been engaged on these questions for a long time as researchers and practitioners. The fact is, a lot of excellent comparative research on sanctions has been conducted in recent years, and our witnesses today have been part of these efforts. They have generously agreed to join us to share their findings and recommendations, and I very much look forward to this conversation because when it comes to sanctions, I think we have to do better. So before introducing the panel, I would happy to yield to our co-chair, Congressman Smith, for any opening remarks that he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for convening this very important hearing. As I think many of our panelists know, Congressman McGovern and I introduced the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Act. I was the prime sponsor, and he strongly supported everything we're doing. And finally, the Senate version was included in the National Defense Authorization Act, and of course, their version was nearly identical to ours. I think we both pushed this legislation, which has now become the single most important sanctioning tool in our arsenal, underscoring a belief that sanctions can be an effective means to bring about accountability. I would note that I was the prime author of the Belarus Democracy Act of 2004, and that was an attempt to ameliorate some of the worst behaviors by Lukashenko. We were able to get many political prisoners out of the Gulag in Belarus, many of whom were tortured horribly with the use of the Belarus Democracy Act. And that did become the template for the Global Magnitsky Act as well as the Magnitsky Act itself. Yet GloMag is also, and this is important, it's a surgical tool, one that targets corrupt government actors and gross violators of internationally recognized human rights, who are actually the responsible parties, not broad sectors of the country's economy, which can hurt civilians and most often are already the victims of bad governance and human rights abuses. In other words, sanctions like targeted munitions can be smart as opposed to blunt instruments which target populations more broadly. I think that the Marshall analogy is an apt one, likening sanctions to munitions, as sanctions can be a tool with regards to conflict, albeit one which stops short of actual war. Indeed, an interesting book released earlier this year, written by Nicholas Mulder, traces the history of sanctions, is entitled The Economic Weapon, The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War. Yet we often sanction bad behavior more broadly because we hope to deter conflict or to bring about an end to an existing conflict. Thus, we sanction Russia for initiating a horrific war in Ukraine and annexing the sovereign territory of a neighboring country, and Iran for its support of terrorism around the world, from neighboring Iraq to Argentina, where the Jewish Community Center was targeted in 1994. I would note parenthetically that I visited that center a few years back and saw the large loss of life and the fact that there has been no accountability for that act of terrorism. We will listen today to a number of arguments which will examine the humanitarian impact of sanctions. There is a certain weighing what needs to be done, a moral calculus that measures what collateral impact the targeting of bad actors has on civilian innocence. There are also practical considerations. As the People's Republic of China seeks hegemony, across the globe, particularly in Africa, and seeks to supplant the dollar as the reserve currency, we need to recognize its appeal to corrupt dictators whom it beckons to remove themselves from our financial system and thus rendering sanctions ineffective. The world is not in such a place yet, but we do need to be mindful during this time of economic tumult that there are practical risks of over-sanctioning. We also need to anticipate whether sanctions can help bring about the change that is desired, or whether they simply would exacerbate a bad situation in the long run. For example, there's currently a horrible civil war in Ethiopia, where atrocities are committed by all sides, not simply both sides, as a conflict is far more multifaceted and complex than a simple binary conflict. With sanctioning the generally friendly to America Ethiopian government, while not concomitantly sanctioning the rebels who started the war, help bring about an end to the conflict, or would it push the government to China for support, or perhaps bring the rebels who were formerly in power, where they arguably inflicted greater atrocities on the people than the current government, would it bring them back to power? We all remember the Meles regime. There are questions that need to be asked, and certainly in the case of Ethiopia, there's an important role for surgical global Magnitsky sanctions, which target those on all sides responsible for war crimes and atrocities. So where does that leave us? As one of our witnesses, Gabriel Nahorna, rightfully states, as we weigh the humanitarian impact of sanctions, we also need to keep in mind that sanctions serve as a powerful tool for U.S. government to protect the innocent, weaken terror groups and oppressive regimes, and bring a measure of justice to the families and loved ones of those persecuted, tortured, and killed. Sanctions, as he goes on to say, can deprive hostile governments of revenue used to wage warfare against our allies and partners and of course against their own people, to finance terrorism or personal corruption and disrupt their ability to procure and proliferate weapons of mass destruction. With that in mind, I yield back and I thank you, Chair.
Thank you, and appreciate your opening statement. And now I want to introduce our panel. Dr. Bruce W. Gentleson is the William Preston Few Professor of Public Policy and a Professor of Political Science at Duke University, and a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. His book, Economic Sanctions, What Everyone Needs to Know, just came out in September. He's served in a number of U.S. foreign policy positions, including as senior advisor to the State Department Policy Planning Director from 2009 to 2011 in the Clinton administration, State Department, and as a foreign policy aide to Senators Al Gore and to Dave Durenberger. Dr. Erica Murray is a senior researcher at the Global Governance Center and Geneva Center of Humanitarian Studies at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Affairs in Geneva. She's also policy director at the Swiss Center for Policy Engagement, PoliSync, where she teaches training courses on sanctions for humanitarian actors, and she serves as a senior fellow on sanctions and humanitarian affairs at the United Nations University Center for Policy Research. And I'm abbreviating everybody's biographies, but the total biographies will all appear in the record in full. Delaney Simon is a senior analyst for International Crisis Group's U.S. program. She researches and writes about U.S. foreign policy and conflict zones and non-military tools for crisis prevention. She joined the crisis group in October 2021, and previously she worked for the United Nations in Afghanistan, Lebanon, and Yemen, where she advised senior United Nations officials on political stability, conflict migration, and humanitarian planning. She's also worked as a special assistant to Afghanistan's ambassador to the United Nations in New York, and as a researcher on conflict policy in Colombia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and elsewhere for the United Nations and other organizations. Ashla Bali is a professor of law at Yale Law School. Her teaching and research interests include public international law, particularly human rights law and the law of the international security order, and comparative constitutional law with a focus on the Middle East. She's written on humanitarian intervention, the roles of race and empire, and the interpretation of enforcement of international law and constitutional design in religiously divided societies, among many other topics. Prior to joining Yale Law School, she was professor of law at UCLA School of Law, where she was the founding faculty of the Promise Institute for Human Rights. Dr. Daniel W. Dresner is a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and a non-resident senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Prior to joining the Fletcher School, he taught at the University of Chicago and the University of Colorado at Boulder. He's previously held positions with Civic Education Project, the RAND Corporation, and the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and received fellowships from the German Marshall Fund of the United States, Council on Foreign Relations, and Harvard University. He's written many books, and we're happy that he's here as well. Gabriel Noronha is a fellow in the Gemunder Center for Defense and Strategy at the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. From 2019 to 2021, he served as special advisor for the Iran Action Group at the U.S. Department of State, where he coordinated policy and directed the State Department's communications and congressional affairs for Iran. From 2017 to 2019, he worked as special assistant for the Senate Armed Services Committee under Chairman John McCain and Jim Inhofe, helping write and pass Congress's annual national security legislation. He has worked for U.S. Senator Kelly Ayotte from 2015 to 2016. He previously served as executive director of the Forum for American Leadership and works on a range of national security and political projects. He speaks and conducts research in Russian, Mandarin, and Spanish. So I thank you all for being here, and I will now turn this over to Dr. Gentleson to begin.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman McGovern and Congressman Smith. I appreciate the invitation, and I commend the Commission on its attention to this issue of economic sanction and human rights and related issues. And I'm privileged to join my wonderful set of colleagues here. As was mentioned, and my publisher would kill me if I didn't at least hold it up. My book on sanctions just came out a couple of weeks ago, and it deals broadly with sanctions. Why are sanctions used so much? What are the varieties? How do we measure success? What does it take to be successful? And what lessons can policymakers derive for the why, how, and when to wield sanctions? I've also been involved both in the media and writing a number of pieces on the Russia-Ukraine sanctions. But here I've been asked to really address particularly the ethical dimension of human rights sanctions. And my colleagues will also address other aspects of that. I think as well as intended as sanctions may be, sanctions imposed because of human rights risk posing a fundamental ethical dilemma, which we can think of as of intentions versus consequences. Take, for example, Myanmar. On the one hand, how could the United States not impose sanctions on the Myanmar military after its brutal coup in February 2021? Shouldn't brutalizers be made to pay a price? Don't internal opponents deserve to know how the international community stands for them? Don't we have to stand up for American values? Yet the military and its supporters have largely insulated themselves from the sanctions, which, according to some NGOs, have ended up as a factor in quote, a humanitarian and displacement catastrophe. And what about Afghanistan, as was mentioned earlier? This was a terrible regime after the Taliban victory in 2021. Yet, as last winter set in, there were estimates of 9 million people facing starvation. And David Miliband, the former British foreign minister and head of the International Rescue Committee, warned that the current humanitarian crisis could kill far more Afghans than the past 20 years of war. There have been carve-outs that we've made. There have been efforts to target the sanctions. But as Congressman McGovern has said, these haven't fully alleviated this humanitarian aspect and this question about what our intentions are versus our consequences. In fact, last Sunday on Cuba, there was a full-page ad in the newspaper, in the New York Times, saying, "Let Cuba rebuild," urgent appeal to President Biden, saying at least for 6 months after Hurricane Ian, can some of the sanctions on construction materials be lifted? So the issue keeps coming at us in a variety of ways. And it's really a tough issue, as the members of Congress particularly know. We want to affirm our core values and principles, as well as other U.S. foreign policy interests and considerations. But there is this ethically problematic humanitarian aspect. And in terms of a template for thinking about it across cases, I see two main types of issues here. One I call backfiring, and the other I call misfiring. Backfiring are when sanctions have effects counterproductive to the intended target state policy change. One example is a study in the Journal of Policy Research of 95 countries for the period 1981 to 2000 that showed how sanctioned regimes cracked down even more on human rights, including torture and political killings. And misfiring is where you end up hitting the people and not the regime. And there have been a number of cases, some of which have been mentioned, others will probably be mentioned as we go along, where sanctions have worsened life expectancy and infant mortality and child malnutrition and women's health and overall public health and clean water and sanitation and refugees and internally displaced persons. Back in the 1990s, I remember the Haiti case in which the poor bore the bulk of the burden while the regime and the supporters were minimally affected, leading to such takeoffs in Creole on embargo, which was the Creole word for embargo, as embargo, meaning under the heels of the rich and powerful. The Venezuela case has already been mentioned, which is in no way to take away from the principal responsibility of the humanitarian crisis for the Chavez and Maduro regimes. But nevertheless, and despite that, the American sanctions have added to much of the suffering. And similarly in Iran after COVID-19, there are lots of examples. Syria as well. But let me just wrap up in the interest of time and with 5 policy recommendations. One, I think, is we need to stop making sanctions the default option. And we need to build net assessment into the front end of the policy process, weighing costs and risks. And again, I've been involved in the policy when I served in state 2009, 2011, in the early days of the Iran sanctions, back in the 93-94 period on China Tiananmen Square in the Clinton-Gore administration. And so as we often do with military force, we really need to do a net assessment on the front end. What are the costs and risks? What are the prospects of backfiring? What are the prospects of misfiring? What are the prospects, if you will, of crossfiring and creating tensions with allies or additional burdens on frontline states that might be allies? Jordan in the case of Iraq, Colombia in the case of Venezuela. And then, what about the costs we may bear at home in terms of economic and otherwise? And we need to be open to the notion that sanctions may not just be not working, but they may be net negative in the sense of making U.S. policy worse and the people affected. So one thing is in the policy process to have a net assessment, not just reach for this as the default option. Secondly is get past the frequent assumption that the greater the economic impact, the more likely the policy compliance. The GAO did a study in 2019, which still bears today, wasn't just of the Trump administration, but criticized the tendency to focus principally on sanctions' economic impact and not, as they put it, sanctions' overall effectiveness in achieving broader U.S. goals or objectives. Third, higher priority to efforts to mitigate the humanitarian consequences, such as private sector de-risking, carve-outs, and the like, but to give this more priority and not be satisfied with saying, well, we just tried here and that the regime, made it impossible. Fourth, I think, is, as heinous as the behavior and repression of many of our adversaries are, human rights sanctions often work better against allies and partners that are receiving U.S. military aid or military-like aid, trade, and technology, where these may combine with other levers in the relationship to actually pressure some opening up. We saw this in the 70s and the 80s with some of the military aid sanctions against Latin American militaries. And frankly, even if they stay repressive, the U.S. is less directly impacted. And lastly, we need to view sanctions as part of, not instead of, diplomacy. They need to be combined with diplomacy. This was one of the successes in the South Africa anti-apartheid case. This was part of the success with Iran and the JCPOA. This was part of the success in 2003 in the Bush administration on issues with Libya and its WMD programs and some terrorism. But too often they're seen of instead of diplomacy. They need to be part of it. So I'll stop there and turn it over to my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murray.
Thank you very much. Co-chairs McGovern and Smith, distinguished members of the Commission, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify on humanitarian impacts of economic sanctions today. I've been working on sanctions now for some 20 years. During this time, I've explored questions of impacts and effectiveness of these measures imposed against targets such as those in Russia, Iran, North Korea, Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, and Cuba. And I've also worked on many of the emerging issues and challenges facing this ever-popular tool of foreign and security policy. For the past decade, I've specialized increasingly on humanitarian impacts of sanctions, including in relation to vulnerable civilian populations, global trade and finance, as well as humanitarian assistance. I'll draw on this work today, which has included my own research as part of multidisciplinary teams, my role as coordinator of multi-stakeholder dialogues seeking solutions to these problems, often with US involvement and typically on behalf of the European Union, the United Nations, and the Swiss government, as well as my close engagement with the national tri-sector groups on financial sector de-risking. In spite of the growing popularity of sanctions and their versatility in tackling a range of global challenges, I would argue that we've now reached a new crisis point in their use. The spotlight is again on humanitarian consequences some 20 years after the creation of targeted sanctions that were supposed to minimize negative impacts on ordinary civilians following the comprehensive sanctions regimes against Iraq, the former Yugoslavia, Cuba, and Haiti. As such, I'll first describe the direct impacts of ordinary civilians. Now, demonstrating direct causal effects of sanctions remains something of a methodological challenge as they don't exert an impact in a vacuum. The topic also, of course, forms the focus of highly politicized debates and narratives, and sometimes sophisticated disinformation campaigns that seek to discredit autonomous or unilateral sanctions use. These narratives also serve to lessen support from non-Western countries that could otherwise play a vital role in supporting US sanctions, such as the case of Russia, such as through not filling commercial gaps or engaging in sanctions evasion or sanctions busting. In spite of this, a range of detailed studies suggest that sanctions can have an impact on ordinary civilians in a number of ways. Sectoral, energy, and financial sector bans in particular appear to have the greatest impact on livelihoods of ordinary populations. Inflation and economic contraction can limit demand for exports, and a lack of foreign capital and other inputs needed for production can hinder private investment. This can lead to lower demand for labor, putting downward pressure on real wages and increasing unemployment. Sanctions can also serve to limit the ability of diaspora groups to send remittances to their loved ones, living in sanctioned countries. And this is important in the light of the fact that these flows of funds can often serve as a vital lifeline at times of economic stress. Household income can be squeezed at the same time that prices for food and other goods increase. And impacts have been shown to be felt particularly among vulnerable groups, particularly women, children, those on fixed income, such as the elderly, those suffering from chronic health problems, and refugee groups. The second area I'd like to describe today is the impact that the increasingly complex sanctions environment can have on global finance, financial services, and trade. What we know is that financial sector de-risking is worsening around the world. The rapid decline in the remaining number of active correspondent banking relationships to certain countries has been described as a global crisis by the likes of the G20, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Financial Stability Board, and the Financial Action Task Force. Some countries now suffer from partial or total financial exclusion as a result of the withdrawal of financial institutions, signifying that there's no longer a way to execute payments into or out of the country through formal banking channels and other regulated payment mechanisms. Some countries such as North Korea and Sudan have been completely cut off from access to international banking services. Countries such as Syria and Afghanistan that I've worked very closely on in recent years may soon follow suit. We've charted the number of correspondent banking channels into these countries, and they have declined extremely rapidly, and very few remain. Turning to trade, over-compliance, or the chilling effect, is also prevalent across the entire supply chains of essential goods, but also wider trade and financial services such as investment and insurance with regards to heavily sanctioned countries. Collectively, this results in widely documented challenges such as delays, inflated costs, and increased bureaucracy at best, or difficulty accessing any functioning financial channels or essential goods at worst. Financial exclusion has also been shown to serve as a driver for the onset of new conflicts, the rise in extremist ideologies, gender inequality, and human rights abuses such as modern slavery and human trafficking. This not only represents a threat to US security interests, but also to global peace and stability. And in spite of over 40 initiatives that have focused on the problem of financial sector de-risking and wider overcompliance, that have been carried out over the past 10 years and proposing solutions to the problems, accompanied, I should add, with excellent high quality recommendations, the situation has only got worse. Sanctions and related regulations also impact negatively on the operations of not-for-profit organizations, including those providing humanitarian assistance. Challenges include confusion over permissible activities, difficulty navigating multiple sanction regimes and other regulations, increased costs and resourcing requirements, and ultimately diverting humanitarian funds from those who are most in need. There's widespread consensus among the humanitarian community that current licensing processes are not fit for purpose, and guidance is not typically available enough or clear enough, especially for those NPOs operating outside of the United States, who nevertheless need to take into account the sometimes global reach of some of the legislation. Studies suggest that comfort letters and safe harbor documents often aren't enough to reassure banks to continue providing them with accounts or servicing humanitarian payments. NPOs are increasingly thus forced to make use of less regulated payment channels such as hawala or the carrying of cash across borders. Nevertheless, this is in the context of poorly coordinated donor agreement on the use of such informal value transfer mechanisms such as hawala and ever restrictive donor agreements governing their activities. Cumulatively, these pressures result in less humanitarian financing reaching the areas where the needs are most acute. So turning to some solutions, and then I'll conclude. Some tentative progress has, of course, been made in the United States and at Congress in the last 18 months to address some of the humanitarian challenges associated with contemporary sanctions practice. This has included the Treasury 2021 sanctions review, the resumption of the US Tri-Sector Working Group on de-risking, and the general licenses created in connection with Afghanistan since the Taliban resumed power in August of 2021, which have been widely recognized as a benchmark for exemptions in other sanctions regimes. Nevertheless, the United States, with its close partners, should urgently prioritize a number of steps to address some of these worst impacts. First of all, to safeguard humanitarian banking channels and the trade in essential goods to the worst hit countries. This could include public interventions, making use of international or regional public financial institutions in contexts where access to formal banking sector is no longer available. It could mean the provision of political and financial support to explore the strengthening and mainstreaming of special purpose vehicles like INSTEX, or other mechanisms such as the Swiss Humanitarian Trade Agreement to be used on a more global basis. To consider the potential for greater use of technology that can play a positive role in the transparent tracking of legitimate funds. And then to turn to recommendation 2 would be enhanced compliance guidance, dialogue and capacity building across sectors. This could be facilitated through the creation of a global tri-sector group. Support for banks and NPO due diligence costs would also be valuable and warrants further thinking, in my view. And forging a better understanding on how to incentivize banks, and particularly correspondent banks, not to de-risk. 3 is improved sanctions design and monitoring. This could include detailed assessments on humanitarian and public health impacts of sanctions before they're even put in place, and also for those which are already in place. This can include reviews, expert input, and so on. It could also include the automatic use of broad standing exemptions across as many sanctions regimes as possible from the outset, and not necessarily where the humanitarian situation has already deteriorated. 4 would be greater flexibility in sanctions easing. The US has used sanctions suspensions flexibly in many instances in recent years. And this could be temporary, reversible, and doesn't necessarily imply a loss of face, particularly in context of humanitarian crises. The question exists, of course, of whether sweeping sectoral sanctions are always appropriate in contexts where public services, such as hospitals and schools, are already at a fragile state, or at best, or non-existent at worst, in light of conflict and other factors. There could also be better joint monitoring of multi-layered regimes to understand the cumulative impacts and mitigate the consequences collectively. I'll conclude there just by saying that these types of sticking plaster or firefighting solutions that I've described need to happen in parallel with efforts to address the systemic drivers of negative consequences that we see in relation to sanctions. And this could benefit from a fundamental rethink of how they're used and a return to more targeted measures. And doing so will help safeguard the legitimacy and effectiveness of sanctions and allow for the continued flow of commodities and finance, essential goods and humanitarian action around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Simon.
Thank you, Co-Chair McGovern, Co-Chair Smith, and distinguished members. Thank you for the opportunity to address the Commission. It's an honor to testify before you and in the company of such distinguished panelists. I'm a senior analyst at the International Crisis Group, a global organization with a mandate to prevent, mitigate, and resolve deadly conflict. As noted in my written testimony, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to sanctions. In some contexts, sanctions can be a tool to help mitigate or prevent conflict, but in others, they can undermine conflict prevention and resolution efforts. Deciding whether sanctions are the right tool requires a careful weighing of costs and benefits in the context of local dynamics. Still, my research over the past several months suggests recurring ways in which sanctions can impede conflict prevention and resolution. I want to highlight 5 of these now and offer some ideas about how to address them. First, sanctions can be excessively difficult to lift. Sanctions can sometimes push parties to start peace negotiations or reach agreements, but that works best if the sanctions are accompanied by credible promises of relief. Sanctioned actors who don't believe that sanctions will be lifted, perhaps because of US politics or even bureaucratic inertia, are less likely to come to and to make concessions at the negotiating table. One high-profile illustration is negotiation of US re-entry into the Iran nuclear deal, but there are other examples. In Colombia, one armed group, the ELN, mentioned the fraught sanctions removal process as a reason for their reluctance to join peace negotiations. They were not convinced that an agreement would yield sufficient benefits. Second, outdated sanctions programs can hinder the implementation of peace deals. Again, in Colombia, a 2016 peace deal with the rebel group known as the FARC was meant to transform the group by offering its members licit livelihoods and integration into society, but the group remained designated as a foreign terrorist organization for 5 years after the peace deal was signed. And during that time, many demobilized combatants couldn't get jobs, aid, or bank accounts. And this hurt the implementation of the peace accords. When I visited Colombia earlier this year, one former commander told me that sanctions did not affect the FARC in wartime, But after they agreed to make peace, the sanctions started to sting. Third, sanctions can sometimes make it harder to advance other peace and stability-related goals, such as economic recovery. Investors often lacked confidence to enter markets where sanctions exist. High compliance costs, the risks of massive fines, and other uncertainties deter them, as my co-panelists have outlined already. In Afghanistan, for example, foreign firms lack confidence to re-engage despite broad general licenses in place. And this hinders the stated US policy, which is to help with economic revival in that country. Such hesitancy often remains even when sanctions are lifted, as firms worry that they will be reimposed. Fourth, sanctions can hamper the work of peacebuilding organizations. These NGOs, often funded by the US government, perform important functions like rebuilding ties within divided communities, convening warring parties to discuss violence reduction, and disarming former combatants. But sanctions can pose them serious operational challenges. Banks sometimes limit or deny them services due to concerns about facilitating transactions that could involve sanctioned parties. And in some places, peace-building organizations simply can't function unless they work with service providers that are sanctioned, such as an organization in Syria whose local staff needed to fly on the sanctioned national airline. Fifth, carve-outs do not usually cover peace-building activities. Without carve-outs, legal risks and compliance costs often force peace-building organizations to curtail their work. For example, reintegration and trauma healing projects led by USAID partners in the Democratic Republic of Congo cannot include former members of sanctioned armed groups, including former child soldiers. While the US government commendably issues licenses and other carve-outs for humanitarian activities, it could do more to extend these to peace-building efforts, which also lessen the toll of conflict on populations. I will now highlight two reforms that can lessen the negative impacts of sanctions on peacemaking, some of which have been hinted at by my co-panelists. First, new and existing sanctions programs should require the following three measures: clear statements of the foreign policy objectives they are intended to further, periodic reauthorization requirements, and regular reviews submitted to Congress on the extent to which they are meeting their foreign policy objectives and affecting humanitarian and peace-building activities. Some sanctions authorities include renewal requirements, but renewals are usually pro forma. Reauthorization requirements, accompanied by descriptions of policy objectives and meaningful reviews, could prompt policymakers to weigh the costs and benefits of the sanctions that they have imposed and allow an opportunity for the executive branch and Congress to gauge whether sanctions are achieving their objectives. Reviews submitted to Congress would also provide a basis for considerations on calibrating, relaxing, or lifting them in line with political or conflict-related developments and help to address the peace-building impacts of sanctions that I have outlined. Second, US policymakers should consider carve-outs for peace-building activities. The Treasury Department should be prepared to issue licenses permitting peace-building organizations to work, of course, when acting in good faith with appropriate risk management. A global general license to be developed in consultation with humanitarian and peace-building organizations is another idea worth consideration. Congress should support these efforts by creating appropriate legislative exceptions for peace-building activities in the sanction regimes the statutes underpinning the sanctions regimes, including a carve-out in the criminal prohibition on providing material support to terrorism. Thank you for your attention today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Dr. Bali.
Thank you so much, Chairman McGovern and Co-Chair Smith. I'm grateful for the invitation and honored to join my colleagues on this panel. We've heard a lot about the empirical effects of sanctions, and I was asked to provide a legal analysis of the human rights rules applicable to these regimes, which will be the focus of my remarks. As both the chairman and co-chair Smith noted in their opening comments, sanctions are often presented as a humane alternative to war. Indeed, sanctions are frequently a tool used by states to punish regimes accused of grave human rights violations in the name of accountability under international human rights law. This is paradoxical because in practice, as we've also heard, comprehensive sanction regimes may cause indiscriminate harm to the target state's economy, producing severe humanitarian consequences for civilians that themselves imperil the human rights of vulnerable populations. And so this challenge of a human rights enforcement tool that itself endangers human rights is a conundrum for the human rights legal framework. In peacetime, imperiling access to adequate resources for survival, such as food, clean water, sanitation, and essential medicines, as well as access to humanitarian assistance through the imposition of sanctions, must be subject to international rules, at least as protective of civilians as those that are applicable in times of armed conflict. And in times of armed conflict, impeding civilian access to such goods would actually be prohibited. So the question is, how does the international human rights law framework regulate the imposition of sanctions? And in the remainder of my remarks, I want to describe what the human rights law framework for regulating sanctions is, suggest circumstances under which they might be prohibited due to their impact on the humanitarian welfare of civilians, and offer recommendations for how sanctions can be designed to be more human rights compliant. You'll find that my recommendations dovetail with many of those you've already heard. The United Nations Charter is the baseline international law obligation from which the United States owes human rights obligations broadly in the international community. The UN Charter imposes obligations on all member states, including the United States, to assist the organization in the furtherance of its mandate, including protecting and promoting international human rights, a mandate of which the United States was the chief author. The International Bill of Rights, which includes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, together define the basic framework of international human rights referenced by the Charter. According to these sources of international human rights law, everyone has a right to a minimum core of economic and social rights necessary for human survival, which includes access to food, clean water, sanitation, and essential medicines. And this right requires, at a minimum, that states not adopt policies that either deliberately deny civilians access to these indispensable resources or have the foreseeable effect of blocking that access. Of course, it's especially important that sanctions imposed in the name of human rights not themselves harm the very civilians they purport to protect. And sanctions adopted in the name of protecting civil and political rights must not imperil the minimum core of economic and social rights indispensable to both human survival and human dignity. The most coherent reading of existing international human rights law, including the core treaties, taken together with the commentary of human rights treaty bodies and expert mechanisms, and the understanding of crimes against humanity under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, would regulate the imposition of sanctions and prohibit imposing measures that give rise to conditions of starvation among a civilian population. I should specify here that under international law, starvation is understood as a process, not an outcome, and the definition of starvation includes imperiling access to basic goods necessary for human survival, such as those that I've named as minimum core economic and social rights, namely food, clean water, essential medicines, and sanitation. Starvation is not limited to death, but encompasses deprivations that result over time in severe malnutrition or other health harms that could induce death or imperil survival. Comprehensive sanctions regimes might, under some circumstances, risk threatening or contributing to starvation conditions along these lines and under this definition by blocking supplies of necessary foodstuffs or essential medicines to the target country. Sanctions regimes that produce such a threat are violative of international human rights law and must be adapted to protect the humanitarian welfare of the affected civilian population. In this connection, it is also important to specify that humanitarian waivers and other efforts to carve out specific exemptions or provide general licenses for certain indispensable goods from otherwise comprehensive sanctions rarely have the intended effect, as has already been described by my co-panelists, and do not therefore in themselves satisfy human rights obligations related to sanctions, especially when unilateral sanctions imposed by a single state without multilateral authorization are packaged together with secondary sanctions compelling other states to comply and themselves participate in the risk of inducing starvation-related conditions. As we've heard, secondary sanctions affect third parties' ability to trade or engage in financial transactions with the target country, and they induce overcompliance. States, corporations, NGOs, and even humanitarian agencies desist from transactions with the target country to avoid triggering secondary sanctions, even where waivers and exemptions are applicable. This is true because they fear mistakenly becoming subject to secondary sanctions or deem the cost of compliance in obtaining a waiver or litigating an exemption to be too great. For an aid agency working internationally, being cut off from international financial transactions due to the provision of humanitarian supplies to a sanctioned country country imperils their work globally. And as we've already heard, this is a risk many corporations and NGOs have proven unwilling to take, regardless of how well designed a humanitarian waiver exemption system might be. If in practice sanctions, subject to whichever waiver or license system, still threaten to induce conditions of starvation, they will be unlawful, independent of the design, motivation, or intention to mitigate those risks. Given this analysis, and given that international human rights law would prohibit sanctions regimes whenever they threaten or contribute to the risk of starvation or severe food insecurity and humanitarian harm to civilian populations, there are important implications for how best to design sanctions regimes that are human rights compliant. I will end my remarks by offering 4 such recommendations in broad terms, and would be happy to answer questions about how they might be more specifically tailored. First, the design of any sanctions package should include an ex-ante human rights impact assessment, as we've already again heard from my co-panelists. This would mean putting in place mechanisms not only for that initial impact assessment, but also for ongoing monitoring of effects of sanctions on the civilian population of a targeted country, including through an annual impact statement to Congress. Second, tailored sanctions should be narrowed not only for effectiveness with respect to policy objectives, but also narrowly tailored to take into account collateral effects. For instance, sanctions may be narrowly targeted, but still produce serious and structural human rights harms when they target critical institutions such as a central bank or a state-owned enterprise essential to the provision of indispensable goods for human sustenance. So, under these conditions, narrow tailoring alone is not enough to secure human rights compliance. Sanctions must be specifically tailored to avoid collateral human rights risks, which requires that those collateral risks be taken into account both in an ex-ante assessment and in ongoing monitoring. Third, any broad-based sanctions package must incorporate an automatic suspension clause for extraordinary circumstances of natural disaster or transnational crises affecting the humanitarian welfare of civilians in the target state. We've heard the example of Hurricane Ian in Cuba and how great relief might be made possible if you had, in fact, an automatic suspension clause available at present to enable economic recovery there following the hurricane. Similarly, in the context of a global pandemic, an automatic suspension taking into account transnational crises affecting the humanitarian welfare of civilians would have been appropriate. Finally, current research shows that sanctions are far easier to introduce than to lift or reverse, again, as my co-panelists have attested. Sanctions that do not meet their policy objectives in the first years following imposition also have a diminished likelihood of achieving those ends going forward. For these reasons, I would also endorse the recommendation made by my colleague who immediately preceded me, that sanctions packages should be designed with a sunset provision that requires, at a minimum, reauthorization, ideally after a period of 2 years. And the reauthorization process should include a fresh appraisal of the human rights impacts of the measures imposed as time goes by and as the conditions on which sanctions have been imposed have changed. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dresner.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Co-Chair Smith, for this opportunity to testify. I have been researching economic sanctions for more than 25 years. When I first began researching this foreign policy tool, the conventional wisdom in Washington, D.C. was that sanctions served a purely symbolic function of, quote unquote, doing something when there was no other available policy option. A quarter century later, economic sanctions have become the policy option of first resort, as the Biden administration acknowledged last year in its sanctions review. There is no denying that 21st century sanctions are both more potent and more targeted than the comprehensive trade embargoes commonly associated with last century's sanctions episodes. Nonetheless, I am concerned that U.S. policymakers, including members of Congress, are overestimating the efficacy of current sanctions and underestimating their collateral damage. This is one reason why I recently authored a peer-reviewed paper entitled How Not to Sanction for the journal International Affairs, which I am submitting as my written testimony. I do not dispute that targeted financial sanctions are more likely to hurt the economic elites of targeted economies. Furthermore, the combination of the dollar's centrality and the reputational concerns of financial institutions has led to considerably less evasion of these sanctions than the trade embargoes of the previous century. I am certainly not opposed to the threat and/or use of economic coercion in principle. Nonetheless, my research, as well as the research of many esteemed colleagues, including many on this panel, suggests that recent U.S. enthusiasm for economic sanctions has been exaggerated. This is for several reasons. First, as the potency of financial sanctions has increased, so have the demands the United States have linked to the sanctions. For example, when the United States exited the JCPOA with Iran and reimposed sanctions in 2018, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo bragged about imposing, quote, the strongest sanctions in history, end quote. He then announced a list of 12 demands on Iran's regime that would have to be met before sanctions would be lifted, 8 of which were unrelated to the nuclear issue. The list seemed so onerous that most observers inferred that the unstated goal was regime change. And indeed, even Secretary Pompeo acknowledged that his list of demands was pretty long. With demands so outsized, no sanctions regime will be able to reach a successful resolution. Venezuela offers another example. It could be argued that the United States had ideal conditions to impose sanctions on that country in 2019. The Maduro regime was running its own economy into the ground. There was a multilateral coalition that supported its ouster, and there was a strong civil society movement within Venezuela that supported the sanctions. Despite these ideal conditions for economic coercion to work, the demand for regime change was perhaps too ambitious. The result has been the further immiseration of the Venezuelan people and the worsening of a serious migration problem in this hemisphere. If sanctions cannot work in these circumstances, imagine the likelihood of success in less favorable conditions. U.S. policymakers either need to be more judicious in their demands or more circumspect in imposing sanctions. The second reason for a more measured approach to sanctions is that the political and humanitarian costs of sanctions on the target population, as well as the populations of neighboring countries, continues to be underestimated. One of the selling points of targeted financial sanctions was that they would function like the precision-guided munitions of economic statecraft, harming elites while sparing populations. The latest wave of sanctions scholarship has been nearly unanimous in its assessment of the negative spillover effects of sanctions, including targeted financial sanctions. Even these sanctions lead to increased suffering in the target economy. And this is for multiple reasons. First, private sector actors engage in overcompliance and de-risking, magnifying the effects beyond what was originally intended. Second, targeted sanctions are usually put in place on top of more comprehensive sanctions that are already in place. The targeted sanctions are therefore additive in effect. Furthermore, sanctions aimed at weakening the target government will often cause that regime to adopt even more repressive measures to stay in power. In my research for the Center for New American Security, I found that comparing sanctioned countries with peer economies revealed a marked decline in human rights protections, an increase in perceived corruption, and a decline in almost every measure of human flourishing. This is particularly true for long-lasting sanctions. And as the United States has become more ambitious in its sanctions aims, the U.S. has also created situations in which the average duration of sanctions imposition has unfortunately lengthened. Another hidden cost of economic sanctions comes from their effect on neighboring countries. Trade embargoes often incentivize corruption in neighboring states by outlawing what would otherwise be ordinary market transactions, creating a fertile ground for black market activity. Financial sanctions dampen this effect, but still create a window for cash transactions across borders. More significantly, even targeted sanctions, in combination with increased repression, lead to large outward migration flows from a sanctioned state. While these citizens are often seeking a better life, in sufficient numbers they can overwhelm neighboring countries, breeding resentment and further civil strife. Proponents of economic sanctions should be sensitive to the prospect of catastrophic failures and spillover effects. Just as successes can lead to excessive optimism about sanctions, catastrophes can distort how policymakers and publics view this instrument of statecraft. To paraphrase Montesquieu, catastrophic sanctions weaken necessary sanctions. I urge the members of Congress to please take care with this instrument. Thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nerona.
Co-chairs McGovern and Smith, distinguished members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to testify regarding the humanitarian considerations of economic sanctions. Since I'm the last witness to speak, I'll also work to address some of the other issues other witnesses have raised and not repeat things too much. I agree with several of their recommendations and disagree with others. Sanctions serve as a powerful tool for the U.S. government to protect the innocent, weaken terror groups and oppressive regimes, and as I often heard firsthand when I served as the State Department's Special Advisor for Iran, bring a measure of justice to the families and loved ones of those persecuted, tortured, and killed. As an implement of statecraft, sanctions can deprive hostile governments of revenue used to wage warfare against our allies and partners, or their own people to finance terrorism or personal corruption and disrupt their ability to procure and proliferate weapons of mass destruction. For example, according to Iranian President Rouhani, the maximum pressure campaign on Iran deprived the regime of $200 billion. In turn, the government had to cut their budget for the IRGC, one of the world's deadliest terror groups, by double digits in 2018 and 2019. The IRGC then massively decreased payments to the terror group proxies Hamas and Hezbollah, forcing layoffs of hundreds of their fighters. In doing so, countless lives have been saved. Sanctions can avert conflict by also providing an intermediary step between diplomacy and warfare, and at times have created the conditions that led to successful diplomatic negotiations, including, regardless of your opinion of it, the 2015 Iran deal. The main reason the Maduro regime seeks negotiations now is to pursue the removal of the US sanctions and regain access to frozen funds. A recurring pattern over the past few years is that the regime abandons talks once it perceives the level of international and domestic pressure has diminished. One reason that talks have faltered may be that the Biden administration has yet to impose sanctions on Venezuela. However, sanctions are not a panacea to those suffering under the thumb of oppressive regimes. As some of the witnesses and chairs have noted, the US government should not solely rely on sanctions as the means to provide justice to the oppressed or to weaken hostile states. There's a growing tendency among both the legislative and executive branches and the press and public to look to sanctions as the first and only resort when other more effective solutions sometimes exist. The US government should also consider creative messaging and information campaigns to weaken targets. They should employ judicial prosecution and seizures and harness technological solutions to help those who suffer under authoritarian states. The United States should bolster the long-term effectiveness of its sanctions programs by negotiating trade deals and supply chain resiliency programs to maintain the preeminence of the US financial system and trade relationships. We must work to preclude the widespread adoption of hazardous alternative financial payment networks, particularly those led by the People's Republic of China or the Russian Federation. Those networks could limit the impact of US sanctions in the future by insulating transactions conducted via these systems from US jurisdiction. And the United States must continue to enforce existing sanctions, particularly on North Korea and Iran, to maintain their efficacy. The governments of Iran, Venezuela, Syria, and North Korea were sanctioned by the United States, among other reasons, after they repeatedly massacred and tortured their own citizens, grave misconduct that continues today. These regimes' senior officials plunder their country's natural and public resources. They pilfer then resell medical and humanitarian goods delivered by foreign states and international aid groups for personal profit, even as these regimes' propagandists routinely blame US sanctions for the suffering of their population. They are often aided in these messages by Russian and Chinese governments through elaborate public messaging campaigns. This undermines the political aims of our sanctions programs. So as long as we maintain sanctions, which is likely, we must push back on these false narratives. One example, in early 2020, as COVID spread throughout Iran, the United States offered to provide medical aid to Iran. The Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei quickly rebuffed the offer, and 19 Iranian trucks full of medicine were then shortly thereafter interdicted by Iraqi authorities for smuggling. The Iranian Ministry of Health in March 2020 kicked out a Doctors Without Borders team, which was setting up a treatment facility. In January 2021, Supreme Leader Khamenei banned Iranians from taking any COVID vaccine produced in the United States or United Kingdom. These stories don't get nearly as much attention as when Iran falsely claimed the United States blocked the transfer of cancer drugs. We actually had facilitated several such shipments. And so I strongly disagree with the idea that sanctions should have sunsets, as that would provide a massive ability for terror groups and rogue regimes to slip through the legal cracks to develop their WMD programs or fund their terrorism and human rights abuse. While these regimes are careless with the well-being of their citizens, the United States goes to great lengths and expense to help preserve humanitarian conditions in the targeted countries, sometimes even at the expense of US national security interests. But that's what makes us different from our adversaries. The United States should ensure that hostile governments do not take advantage of humanitarian exemptions for their own personal gains and nefarious motives. As I outlined in my full written testimony, this can be better accomplished through a few solutions. Some of these address issues or other witnesses have addressed. Number one is overcompliance. Treasury should tackle the issue of overcompliance through much clearer and proactive public messaging of the existing humanitarian exemptions of our sanctions programs. We saw that for good effect with Treasury's Venezuela press notice in 2019 and their more recent COVID relief notice this June. We can and should encourage them to do that much more. Treasury should also reduce the cost and bureaucracy for businesses and nonprofits to receive approvals for conducting humanitarian trade and aid. Just like Congress often talks about the idea of a one-page tax form, we should apply that approach to licenses and comfort letter applications. The US government should build out technological solutions to prevent regime blockades and deliver relief directly to citizens. That's something in particular that could address the remittance issues in Venezuela and Cuba, where the regime likes to take their cut of it. The bulk of my written testimony outlines lessons learned from our recent sanctions programs, particularly against Iran and Venezuela, and offers suggestions to improve outcomes for innocent civilians. Thank you for your opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of you for your testimony. And I know, Mr. Jenlison, you need to leave at 12:30. Am I correct on that? Yeah. So let me just ask a couple of general questions, and I'll ask you some, Mr. Smith, and then I'll come back and ask people individual questions. But let me this issue of sunsetting. Mr. Noronha, you said you don't like the idea of sunsetting. Maybe that's the wrong word. Maybe we could call it or looking for a reauthorization or something, a review of these sanctions, because I got to be honest with you, we don't in Congress, we really don't talk about these things in any detail. I mean, we're not reviewing methodically and thoughtfully, whether the sanctions in Venezuela or Cuba or Iran or, I mean, you name the country, are working or not. What ends up happening is we impose these things, and then, that's it. And then there are all kinds of political forces that make it very difficult, to revisit these things. I mean, nobody wants to look like they're soft on a bad regime, but nonetheless, it is helpful, I think, to find out, are these sanctions achieving what they're intended to achieve, or are we hurting people in the process, or making things worse? Are we putting ourselves at a disadvantage? I guess my question to everybody, anybody else on the panel, does anybody disagree with the idea that there should be some mechanism in place where we are forced to review whether or not these sanctions on whatever country it may be are working or not, and whether we should get rid of them or adjust them or add to them? I mean, and I'm thinking also of how we deal with AUMFs. I mean, we pass AUMFs and then we forget about them, and they're there forever. And, an AUMF passed 10, 20 years ago can be used to justify, another war, in some other place. And where a conflict emerges that didn't exist 20 years ago. And so some of us are pushing for sunsets on AUMFs. The bottom line, if you want to continue them, fine. But it forces Congress to actually have a thoughtful debate to see whether this is worth it. Does anybody agree that that's a bad idea? Yeah, Mr. Noronha?
If I can only clarify perhaps the mechanism to do so, my only worry is that if for reasons of congressional gridlock, an authority that Treasury relies on to issue sanctions expires, even when that's not Congress's intent, that these sanctions could end and then provide opportunities. Yeah. If Congress designed it in a way so that it would encourage and force the debate, I think that's strongly beneficial. I think these sanctions are actually far more beneficial when Congress asserts its role in the sanctions making process, and the executive branch is on congressional authorizations rather than purely on executive orders.
Yeah, I mean, and the reason why I raise this issue is because, I mean, we have lots of, there's lots of stuff in the news about increased migration at our southern border. There's a uptick in numbers of Venezuelans coming to our border. If I was in Colombia not too long ago, there's an incredible amount of migration into Colombia. Again, these are all, I'm not sure that was the intended impact of those sanctions, and even in Cuba. I mean, we eased sanctions during the Obama administrations. I would argue that more political space opened up. But now then we tighten them up again under Trump. Biden has kept those sanctions in place. We don't really talk about them in Congress. I'm not even sure if you did a poll in Congress as to what those sanctions were, whether or not people would even be able to tell you what they are. But we've seen an uptick in Cubans coming to the Mexican border, and yet we don't want to take any more migrants into this country. So, I mean, there needs to be some mechanism to review that. Mr. Gentleson?
Yeah, thanks very much. And I apologize having to leave at 12:30. I have a class I've got to go teach. I agree with your point, Chair McGovern. I think that there's a tendency to, and also the way you contexted it, the politics of not looking soft affects so many issues and frankly, so many policies that can't be justified. And when I served in the Senate as a foreign policy aide a couple times, as well as in presidential campaigns and you hear that. Actually, I think those politics are changing, but that's a separate conversation. I think if you look at opinion polls, not just on specific issues, but those politics are changing. So it opens it up for the kind of changes you're talking about. I would just say too that my emphasis on trying to do this on the front end is really important. I think that the notion of, well, let's just go to sanctions because we don't like military force creates a situation where you got to decide down the road whether you have sunset or what the conditions are. And I think more front-end assessment, both in Congress and the executive branch, of what the net is, what the likely costs and consequences are, could lead you to better policies, as well as not getting in this box down the road of how do you lift something without being soft.
Let me ask everybody really quickly, because I want to be sensitive to your time, Mr. Johnson. I want to go to Mr. Smith in case he has any questions for you. What is the, very briefly, if people could just say, what is your evaluation of the sanctions that we've imposed on Russia in response to the invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah, I think they did not work as a deterrent threat,
Right.
And they did not work in their first sort of shock and awe phase. But we're kind of in a war of attrition now, where Putin is trying to counter them with his sanctions on Europe, particularly on energy. I think the best thing about these sanctions is twofold. One is that not just the effects on the Russian economy, but they are really affecting Russian military capabilities. The Pentagon released figures of about 3,000 pieces of heavy equipment the Russians have lost, largely because of the bravery and courage of the Ukrainian military with US and NATO support. And they're starting having to MacGyver semiconductors out of refrigerators and dishwashers. So targeting that, I don't think you ever get to a point where you generally squeeze them economically. And Putin says uncle. Nobody's ever done that. The end of the day, what they do is they strengthen your hand for leverage and negotiations. We really need to be thinking about, if we get to that point, what are the sanctions that we lift in terms of for what concessions? But we shouldn't expect them somehow to make Putin say too much. I'm just going to turn them off. But they are affecting his military capabilities, which makes the situation unusual and in some ways more effective than others.
Dr. Murray?
Thank you, Chairman McGovern, for the excellent questions. I would like to respond to both, if I may, in one go. And I think when it comes to the case of Russia, I think you hit the nail on the head that we don't currently have a way of assessing the impacts effectively. And I think the big risk that we see happen all too often is that we equate economic damage with effectiveness. And that simply isn't what the sanctions are necessarily out there to do, unless we want sanctions to have a purely punitive function. What we know is that there are different types of impacts that can exert an impact, such as coined by my good colleague Francesco Giumelli. They can constrain access to vital resources. They can coerce a change in behavior. They can signal important messages. And I think having a more nuanced understanding of some of these impacts is really important. And to move away from this prevailing view that decimating a country's economy, putting a stranglehold on a country's population is somehow a measure of effectiveness. And I also welcome the appointment or the announcement of the new post in US Treasury that will assess impacts of sanctions. There's a similar initiative underway in the European Union, and I think this is a promising move as well. Thanks.
Okay, Dr. Dresner?
Thank you, Congressman. Again, I want to address both the questions. With respect to the sunset clauses and the evaluation of sanctions, I do tend to support those with one sort of caveat. In terms of, I think annual assessments in terms of impact on sanctions is actually an extremely useful thing to do, particularly if it's done from the State Department in the same way that they do annual human rights reports or annual reports on religious freedom or what have you. If for no other reason that it would require the U.S. government to measure effectiveness not just in terms of the economic cost, as Professor Murray was just talking about, but also in terms of the likelihood that there would actually yield concessions down the road. That's an important distinction that has to be drawn. With respect to sunset clauses, I do think they're a good idea, but I would also point out that they're not a panacea either, because if you impose sunset clauses, which I do support, what it will inevitably incentivize target countries to do is to try to hold out until the first moment that until the moment that the sunset clause expires. And with the idea that with the hopes that maybe it won't be renewed. And indeed, you saw Russia act in this way after 2014 when it annexed Crimea, when the European Union every 6 months would have to reauthorize the sanctions. There was some hope on the Russian side that maybe wouldn't happen, after a particular time period. So it's not that that's perfect. It creates other sorts of effects, but there are trade-offs in terms of imposing sanctions. And I do think here I somewhat disagree with the notion that Congress should play a more active role in sanctions, just because, again, the track record is obvious on this. It is much harder for Congress to lift sanctions than it is to impose them. And for sanctions to work, there has to be two forms of credible commitment. One is you have to credibly commit to impose sanctions, but the other is you have to credibly commit to lift them if there is some deal that is reached. And I am somewhat skeptical of Congress's ability on that second part of the credible commitment. And with respect to Russia, agreed that sanctions failed as a form of deterrence, and they have failed as a form of coercion. As a necessary complement to the actual fighting on the ground, however, there is pretty strong evidence that they are actually having an effect, and it's part of the reasons why Russia is currently experiencing reverses on the battlefield. And so judging them as, in some ways, I think Co-Chair Smith discussed or referenced Nicholas Mulder's The Economic Weapon. It's worth remembering that modern sanctions originated during World War I as a sort of economic, adjunct to the military fighting. And I think that's how you have to judge the success of sanctions against Russia right now.
Okay. And before I go to Ms. Simon, I just want to say I'm not necessarily a big proponent of having Congress being more involved in putting in place sanctions, but the reality is that they will. And again, we codified sanctions against Cuba. We haven't had a debate on that since the Helms-Burton Law came into effect. So, I mean, if Congress is going to continue to be involved in these things, then there ought to be some mechanism that forces there to be a review. And whether or not Congress has the wherewithal to do, to be able to cut through all the politics and do what's right, who knows? But the problem is that we do these things and we walk away. And some of it's because sometimes it's politically difficult. And I think that's, we need to find a way to be able to have these discussions thoughtfully. I have Ms. Bali. Oh, Ms. Simon first. Let me go to Ms. Simon, then to you. I'm sorry.
No worries. That's okay. Thank you, Congressman. I just wanted to pick up on a point that my colleagues have mentioned, which is this idea of sanctions relief in the context of Russia. Just to say that it's important to not close off considerations about sanctions relief, even though in the current context it seems very far off to consider some type of negotiation, peace negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. But just to highlight that some measures that have been suggested, for instance, the state sponsor of terrorism designation, may close off opportunities to start considering an earnest sanctions relief, and at the same time may have some negative effects on the humanitarian situation situation more broadly in the world, and also on peace negotiations around the world, not only related to Ukraine. So I just wanted to mention that one particular point, picking up on what my colleagues have said. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll go to Dr. Bali, but let me just throw this one other thing, because I know you have a hard stop as well. But we keep on hearing that sanctions are about accountability, but from perspective, sanctions don't satisfy victims' rights. So I think to kind of call them accountability might be a little kind of misleading. But anyway, I turn to you.
Well, I would agree with that final comment from you, Chairman McGovern. The idea that sanctions somehow offer a measure of justice to victims depends on a kind of punitive model. And in the context of our conversation, which is the extraordinary humanitarian harms that can be imposed on the very populations that are offering suffering at the hands of abusive regimes, the notion of further punishing those populations is actually very counterproductive for sanctions regimes specifically designed for abusive regimes. So one would hope that that punitive sort of understanding of sanctions would not be the one motivating policymakers in adopting these regimes. I just wanted to circle back to 2 points with respect to the sunset clause. The first is a point that Dr. Jenelson made in his opening comments, which is that there are circumstances in which comprehensive sanctions regimes can do more harm than armed conflict and war, as with the example he gave in Afghanistan, where you have 9 million people imperiled with starvation, which might cause a far greater civilian impact in terms of death than 20 years of conflict did. Under these circumstances, where the costs are this extraordinary for civilian populations, the idea that we should worry about what kinds of sort of signaling a sunset clause might produce as a reason not to adopt it, I think is a relatively sort of weak argument. Because the harm is so great, for the reasons that you pointed to, Congress has great difficulty lifting sanctions. It's necessary to incorporate a mechanism, I think, ex ante, that enables that process to be unblocked, at least to some extent, and permits some deliberation to take place. We should note that there is an upward ratchet logic within the way that sanctions regimes are designed, where, as again, Dr. Dresner and others pointed out, oftentimes new sets of sanctions are layered on top of existing sanctions. And so you have an additive effect where rather than providing sanctions relief or reducing sanctions, you find sanctions being enhanced because of the political reputational risks of appearing to be weak on bad guys or abusive regimes. Against this backdrop, against the political reality that Congress faces, the necessity of having something like a sunset clause really cannot be overstated.
So I know that you and Dr. Gentleson have to leave by 12:30. So I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Smith in case he has any specific questions for you, and then you guys can go at 12:30, and then he can go with his questions, and I'll come back to you, whoever's remaining after he's done. So, Co-Chair Smith.
Thank you, Co-Chair McGovern. And you know what, the idea of indiscriminate harm, which I think is a very important concept that we all have to be very aware of with sanctions. I remember, because I got elected in 1980, and sanctions against South Africa was a very, very big issue. And I was in favor of those sanctions, comprehensive sanctions, because of the racist apartheid regime. But the argument against it was all about how it would have a deleterious effect on the people of South Africa. And some people called those who opposed it racist. I thought that their argument, while it didn't convince me, certainly had some merit, because some people would get hurt because of the sanctions. So each and every one of these issues has to be looked at individually, obviously. But when you're trying to combat a totally repressive regime, as both Jim and I and others in Congress are trying to do with the Chinese Communist Party, which is committing genocide as we meet during this hearing, what they've done to Tibet, what they are doing in Hong Kong, in taking over that somewhat democratic enclave, and now their threats that they're making against Taiwan, the crackdown on religious freedom, the likes of which we have not seen since Mao Zedong during the Cultural Revolution, the synodization, as that is called, where everything has to comport with Xi Jinping's nightmarish view of religion. All of that's happening right before our very eyes. And we are trying with sanctions to try to change some of that behavior, certainly not be complicit with it, which is why the sanctioning of those goods coming out of Xinjiang was so important. Do we want to enable it by giving them economic help by buying products that are almost assuredly being made in a gulag? I don't think so. So yes, it has harm on people, but you got to weigh that with the outrageous behavior, in this case, by the Chinese Communist Party. I do believe strongly in human rights conditionality, that you have a clear and very, very open linkage to human rights and trade. You know, when Bill Clinton delinked human rights from trade on May 26, 1994, after much fanfare with the linking of human rights, and I applauded him very much when he linked human rights with trade, only to 1 year later or less to delink. We said profits trumps everything. And all we care about is making money, and it's not the means by which it is made in terms of oppression matters very little. Maybe a little jawboning, a little call out, but there's no linkage to human rights. So I think we absolutely have to do a better job of linking, having human rights conditionality. I've reintroduced a bill that would go back to the old Clinton policy, which he abrogated, to say human rights and trade need to be linked with most favored nation status. So I did the same thing with Romania back in the 1980s, when Nicholas Ceausescu was completely torching human rights activists in his country of Romania, and especially religious believers, Jewish, Christian, it didn't matter. He was the oppressor of all. I had a bill to impose MFN linkage to human rights, and it did pass the House, never got through the Senate, but it was, I think, an important initiative. So human rights conditionality, I just throw that out there because, you know, we don't always know what the impacts are going to be. I think sunsets carry some danger. If I'm the bad guys, I wait and say, hey, this all runs out, you know, on March 31st, 2023. I'll wait that out or do something that looks like I'm trying to do a better job, only to find that you do a snapback because once the sanctions are gone. So I understand, the belief there. Now, let me just ask, Mr. Noronha, there's the country-specific human rights and types of sanctions, and then there's thematic ones like religious freedom or trafficking. I'm the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and we wrote right into that law, as we did the International Religious Freedom Act, a carve-out for humanitarian assistance. We in no way want to hurt people when it comes to hunger or all the other issues that the people could be hurt by, but we do want to hold people to account when they're buying and selling and turning women, especially, into commodifying them for sale. And that's what my argument with all administrations has been, Republican and Democrat, is that we have not done enough sanctioning vis-a-vis the thematic human rights like religious freedom or trafficking. Once a country is on tier 3, there should be near certainty that there's going to be some kind of sanctioning coming their way. Same way when they're a country of particular concern or a CPC country. So there is that big difference. I think, those thematic human rights abuses, if we don't come down strong and hard, I meet with diplomats everywhere in my office when I'm traveling abroad. I'm the special representative for human trafficking for the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE, and our sanctions, at least the fear of those and being named a tier 3 country, has incredible impact. Incredible. When George Bush, W. Bush, had the courage to sanction both South Korea and Israel, two of our closest allies, put them on tier 3. I met with the ambassadors and with diplomats, as did the tip office, nonstop, and they got off it the old-fashioned way. They stopped their complicity in human trafficking, both of those countries. Same with Belgrade, you name the country, when they are put on tier 3, it has a very, very serious impact. I wish we would follow it up more with the actual sanctioning, which we do not do, but at least it is there. So, Mr. Noronha, maybe you want to speak to that issue, country-specific versus thematic. I understand. I remember when we were all very concerned about North Korea and the famine that was occurring there, and the WFP was providing food aid. I was all for it, but a lot of food never got to the people. It went to the military. It was diverted. So that doesn't mean we don't try, because again, starvation is a horrible, horrible way to go. But I just throw those two things out, if you would.
Sure. And so I'll provide a couple comments that I know Bruce wants to speak as well before he has to leave. One point is, often after we sanction individuals for all manners of abuses, whether it's economic or human rights, we will get a call from their lawyers, and it is a desperate, hey, we didn't realize, we didn't intend to do things. Can you please remove us from the list? That's the exact outcome we want to see. We want to take remedial steps. If it's in the economic situation, have them make amends for whatever they've done, and do that, and to stop that. If you have multilateral sanctions through the European Union and member states there as well, it's, hey, you can't travel to all of the EU, you can't do any shopping trips. For senior officials, that's very important. And so when you're doing these individual sanctions for whether it's religious freedom, human rights, these don't have negative effects on other civilians, because you're affecting the visas and the spending and the wealth of these individuals. There are really in my view, there are very limited, if any, downsides to these activities, and we should continue doing that on the specific behavior. And again, to the extent that you can get other countries to join in as well. Countries like Canada, for example, don't have a huge bandwidth to look through all the evidentiary packages that the Treasury Department is able to look at. If the United States shares information about the individuals that's added to these lists to partner countries, it may very well be that they look at these cases and say, oh yeah, these are really bad behaviors, and we want to make sure that these are extended as well. And I think that's a way to have collective justice, not just saying you can't come to New York City, but you can't go to Paris and London and have giant apartments there as well.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
If I could just interject for a second, again,
Yes.
apologies for having to leave to teach. Just 2 points that Congressman Smith, you put a lot of points there. I think my sense is everybody here is on the same page in the sense of the question of what is the best way to use sanctions to affirm American principles and values. And I think the question really is whether or not, the action itself, the symbolic action, and the prospects of some influence outweigh the concern about the consequences, this intentions versus consequences. And my view is I think we really need to analyze that, not assume that we shouldn't, but also not assume that we should just because it's the right thing to do. Second thing is really what our objectives are on these issues. And you mentioned human rights conditionality. In these situations where we're really, whether we articulate or not, after regime change, it's just not an achievable objective through sanctions. I'm reminded of around 2010, Spain, working through the Catholic Church, was able to free about 50 political prisoners from Cuba. It was a limited objective. And Fidel was still in power. It was a limited objective. And they lifted some sanctions. And sometimes I think in an effort to achieve the biggest objective in the name of values and human rights, we end up not being able to achieve some more achievable kinds of things. And I think we may want to think about that, about how we set the objective in the sense of another version of human rights conditionality. But again, thanks very much to the two co-chairs, my colleagues, and I'm happy to continue to engage on these issues as may be helpful.
Appreciate that. Thank you so much.
I'll also just jump in to say, unfortunately, I have to leave, but I will I'm grateful for the opportunity and just want to emphasize again that to the extent that we're trying to promote values tied to human rights, it's imperative that we design sanctions in ways that are sensitive to their human rights effects. And while there have been many laudable efforts to do so, the outcomes have been ones that imperil the human rights of civilian populations worldwide. So it's really critically important to get the design right and to shift our current strategy away from broad-based sectoral sanctions that are designed to impose economic punitive conditions in target countries. But I thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to continuing to engage.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. Yield back.
Thank you very much. Let me ask Dr. Dresner. I mean, in your article, how not to sanction, the basis for your remarks today, you discussed two high-profile examples of catastrophic sanctions failure: Iraq in the 1990s and the maximum pressure campaign directed toward Iran under the last administration. Are there other sanction regimes currently in effect that you believe could become catastrophic failures, and if so, which ones? And are there any current examples of situations where you consider the sanction regime to be appropriately calibrated, or where there are good prospects that the stated objectives can be achieved? In other words, where demands are clearly articulated and appropriately right-sized?
Sure. I think it's impossible not to look at the Venezuela sanctions at this point. And again, this is a case where I honestly believe that when the sanctions were imposed, there were decent reasons to believe that there were odds that it might actually work. But I think it's hard to argue at this point that what it has done is, while obviously somewhat weakening the Maduro regime, it has created an even larger stream of migrants, which has caused spillover effects, across the entire hemisphere. So I think that has to count as a catastrophic failure. And to be clear, when we say catastrophic failure on sanctions, we're talking about an outcome in which neither the United States gets anything that it wants, but also the target economy suffers so much that there's significant humanitarian suffering as well. I think it's hard not to look at the current situation in Afghanistan as another example of a failure. And I grant that this is an incredibly knotty problem in terms of how to get humanitarian relief to Afghanistan while simultaneously not recognizing the Taliban as the legitimate rulers of the country. With respect to successful instances in which I think sanctions have worked, in terms of ongoing cases, I don't want to, in some ways, almost by definition, if it's an ongoing case, it probably hasn't worked yet, because ideally, if the demand is right-sized, then presumably there are negotiations being held for it to actually come to an end. I think past examples of this would include the JCPOA with Iran. One of the reasons that worked was that the Obama administration made it clear that the sanctions would actually be lifted if the Iranian regime agreed to those terms, with the understanding that the goal would not necessarily be regime change. As I said, this required policy trade-offs. It was a compromise. Not everyone got what they wanted, but nonetheless, it was a successful example of coercive bargaining. Another example prior to that, I would say, would be when the U.S. successfully negotiated with Libya to have that regime have its WMD program eliminated and be under full inspections. Again, that was an instance where U.S. administration switched from targeting regime change to recognizing they were going to have to deal with the regime, as odious as it might be, but to achieve a concrete policy gain.
Thank you. Ms. Simon, let me, first of all, thank you for reminding us that sanction successes depend on the capacity of negotiators to credibly promise sanctions relief. As someone who follows Colombia closely, I can confirm your observations about the negative impact of delaying the removal of the FARC from the U.S. list of foreign terrorist organizations. And I welcome President Biden's decision to finally take that step. I also welcome your recommendation that sanctions carve-outs for humanitarian organizations should be extended to peacebuilding organizations. This is an area where counterterrorism strategies have had a distorting effect on U.S. interests. We need to recognize that peacebuilding requires engagement with current or former belligerent actors, and that engagement should be encouraged and not penalized. So I know that the crisis group works in conflict situations all over the world, and I guess my question is, in which current conflict situations are prospects for peacebuilding being most negatively affected by the sanctions regime? And do you have examples of situations where easing sanctions had a positive effect on peacebuilding processes?
That's a great question, Congressman, and thank you for asking me. I think I'd prefer to answer your question with an example from my research when I was in Colombia, because it demonstrates how the negative effects of sanctions have affected peace deals, but also how carve-outs can actually lessen those negative effects. And so to come back to Colombia, when I was there, I spent some time with former combatant deminers who had been trained to remove the landmines actually that they themselves had planted in communities in the jungles in Colombia. And these deminers were unable, while the foreign terrorist organization designation was in place, to participate in demining because they required certifications that the certifying agencies weren't able to give them because they were a designated foreign terrorist organization. And also demining trainers refused to work with them because they were concerned about legal risks surrounding the material support provision. But a success story now, since the designation has been lifted, is that these former FARC deminers are working in the communities that they used to be at war in, removing landmines, and that's a real positive story from the lifting of sanctions. If that model can be applied elsewhere, and it doesn't necessarily need to require a sanctions removal. It could just require, for instance, a license for peacebuilding or a license for certain activities that allows activities like demining to take place. And I think that would be a really positive step forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Murray, you mentioned that you're participating in multi-stakeholder dialogues to try to address both the direct and indirect obstacles that sanction regimes are creating for humanitarian providers. Can you tell us a little bit more about those initiatives and how they're going?
Sure. Well, the first one that took 5 years from 2015 to 2020, which was funded by the European Commission and the Swiss government, sought to find a way to allow for the flow of humanitarian funds into Syria. And as you will well know, and my esteemed panelists as well will well know, that Syria represents one of the most complex cases where de-risking is observable. There are very few, if not no, options for remitting formal banking transactions into the country, and that's to say the government-controlled areas, and there are also major problems in remitting funds into the northeast and northwest of the country. So over a period of 5 years, it took that long because it really takes time to establish trust between the different stakeholders. We brought together banks, humanitarian actors, relevant governments and international organizations, and also tech providers. And we also benefited from the presence of OFAC, USAID, and State Department. And that resulted in a guide for humanitarian actors and helped somewhat in providing clarity on the remitting of funds, but it didn't solve the problem. More recently, I am running a series of 4 workshops, again funded by the EU DG ECHO and Swiss government, trying to find technical solutions to the problem of de-risking. Again, we count on the participation of the US Treasury and State Department and other parts of US government and others, really trying to get into the weeds and building on of the recommendations that exist elsewhere to do things like work out how humanitarian banking channels can be protected, also focusing on non-formal payment options and so on. And finally, there is a number of initiatives I'm engaged on with the United Nations Development Programme and the Norwegian Refugee Council, where we're again looking into financial channels into Afghanistan and the better support of private sector actors that are seeking to resume trade in that country, in spite of the fact that, once again, there are barely any functioning financial channels and other formal remittance options into the country. So I'm happy to provide any details of that.
Yeah, but you mentioned that as a result of financial sector de-risking, NGOs and private sector actors are increasingly forced to make use of less regulated payment channels, such as carrying of cash across borders. As a result of this, don't we face a serious risk of incentivizing illicit economic activity in heavily sanctioned countries?
I think that is a key risk. And of course, the very thing that US sanctions are sometimes designed to tackle, and also other regulations like anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism, they can serve as a vicious circle in provoking de-risking and forcing humanitarian actors to make use of hawala and so on. The UN has been instrumental in bringing millions, if not billions, of dollars of cash into Afghanistan, trucking it around the country and so on, or engaging in currency swaps. Ultimately, none of these options are sustainable. There are increasingly ways of harnessing technology to facilitate the safe tracking of humanitarian funds to countries like Syria and Afghanistan, which are deemed to be legally compliant with banks and donors. But this is not a solution to the wider problem. It doesn't allow for full-fledged trade or humanitarian assistance to scale that is required to address the needs in those countries.
Thank you, Mr. Noronha. You recommend that the United States should encourage the use of VPNs and digital wallets so remittances and aid can go straight to the intended targets of family members that are not required to pass through regime intermediaries in sanctioned countries. What risks do digital currencies or unregulated channels for transferring funds create from a corruption perspective, and how would beneficiaries access the technology?
Thanks. That's a great question. Maybe I'll answer the last question first, which is this is when generally you're going to need access to internet, either a phone or a computer device, to use any of these digital wallets, cryptocurrencies. And in a place like Venezuela, where the standard of living is incredibly poor, that might just be a non-starter. In a place like Cuba, it might be a little bit more viable. So you have the state remittance organization, which takes a sizable cut of that go into Cuba to family members. Those are then funded pretty much directly military and security services. So if you had family members and say cryptocurrency to their family members, avoid that cycle. That would also avoid corruption because, again, regime officials can't access it. One of the issues, unfortunately, is that that's the exact same mechanism that enables money laundering, enables sanctions evasion, is this rise of digital and cryptocurrencies. And so it's a very thorny problem of trying to avoid regimes, but when you're avoiding regimes, you can also avoid the US government and financial system. Frankly, there's not a very good answer to this that I've seen from the US financial system. This could also interesting of how do you help a population that's really poor like Venezuela with aid? How do you improve the standard of living for people without it getting to this is a complex problem. I think Treasury should look at this, though. It's applicable across a number of issue areas. Syria, North Korea is probably not one of those, but countries where you don't have regimes trying to engage in WMD programs, where you can enable people-to-people communication completely the Maduro regime often controls all aid mechanisms, whether that's food aid, medicine, medical aid, and it does so to sort of increase its political power. And I think if the United States can invest in those technologies, it would be a game changer.
No, and I get the concern about working with a particular regime that we don't agree with, but it does contribute to kind of deinstitutionalization, and it assumes that it assumes that corruption comes only from regimes, and that's not true. We have to worry about corruption in other places. Let me just kind of ask one last question of everybody here, and I appreciate, again, this has been really interesting. Again, let me just say, there is value to sanctions if they're well thought out. And again, as Congressman Smith mentioned, he and I worked together not only on the Magnitsky legislation, but on the global Magnitsky legislation. I don't think anybody's questioning the value of targeted sanctions on individuals. It is when you do this kind of blanket sanction. Again, it may work in some cases, it may not in other cases, but sometimes I think we in Congress have this one glove fits all approach, and we do things sometimes out of impulses that may be, that grounded in human rights or grounded in a pursuit of justice or grounded in our outrage over a particular regime's behavior. But we don't often talk about the kind of the collateral damage that can come from some of these blanket sanctions. And, I mean, nobody, I don't know of anybody who thinks that Maduro is is anything but a really horrific a leader in Venezuela. Having said that, he's still there. And I've been talking to a lot of the migrants who have crossed into both Colombia and into the United States, and they're talking about the economic hardships, the lack of food, the lack of access to medicine, the lack of opportunity. Again, all, I think it's a terrible economic model, but clearly sanctions have contributed to the negative impact on individual citizens in that country. I'm not saying we walk away from letting them off the hook. I'm just simply saying that maybe we have to talk a little bit more about, is that what our goal is? So, but let me just ask all of you by way of closing here. I mean, Congress, obviously, for better or worse, plays a big role in sanctions regimes. And so, I mean, what are the one or two most important things that Congress can do to reduce the bad collateral effects of sanctions? And and that could be our, and if you have anything else you want to add in closing, please feel free to do it. And one of the terrible things about doing this virtually is that you're all on my screen here, so why don't we begin with Dr. Murray? I'm just going to go down the list here.
Thank you very much, Congressman. This is a fantastic opportunity to feed in another recommendation. I think in the early 2000s, there were a series of processes that at the time were led by a number of different governments, Sweden, Germany, and Switzerland, that led to the creation of targeted sanctions and move away from comprehensive sanctions. And I think we're coming around to a point that we need a new process like this. We're 20 years in to the use of so-called targeted sanctions, where in many cases they now, of course, represent de facto comprehensive sanctions regimes. There's a whole load of other complexities at play as well. And so I would say we need a fundamental rethink of how sanctions are used, and this needs to be an international process. But I say that the US needs to be absolutely central in these considerations. And this is an opportunity to safeguard the future use of sanctions and its legitimacy as well, and minimize some of the negative implications. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Noronha.
I'll perhaps answer that with a challenging problem that doesn't have a great solution. When I think of, I'm generally a proponent of sectoral sanctions more than the other individuals on the panel. The issue I have with them is that often, as I believe Professor Dressner mentioned, what it can do is, instead of, it forces governments into a guns or butter scenario. And unfortunately, sometimes the governments simply just choose to fund guns and repressive mechanisms rather than the well-being of their citizens. That's a real problem. It also sort of defeats the purpose of the sanctions programs, which are to effectuate regime behavior change. The U.S. government really needs to have a really thoughtful process of how do you, when you are putting governments in these positions where you're reducing their economic output, how can you force that into caring for their citizens versus caring for their military and repressive forces? I don't have a clear answer to that immediately, but it's, to me, the greatest single question. Given that we're going to have our sectoral sanctions programs in continuance, it's something that we need to look into.
Thank you. Ms. Simon.
Thank you very much, Congressman, for this opportunity. I think just the hearing that yourself and Co-Chair Smith have convened shows us that these issues are on the agenda increasingly, and I know the work of my colleagues here have been central to make these themes more present in the public conversation. But I'd just like to highlight, which is that sanctions do have a capacity to be a really effective a really effective tool for conflict mitigation and prevention. We've heard a lot of themes today: depriving belligerents of resources, adding incentives to negotiation processes. But I think if I would take anything away, at least from the crisis group perspective, which is focused on the resolution of deadly conflict, it would be to try to tailor sanctions programs to be able to better serve conflict resolution goals, conflict prevention goals, and conflict mitigation goals. And I suggested some ways forward in my testimony, but to have that idea always close to mind in the creation of sanctions, but also in the assessing of sanctions programs that are already in existence.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Dresner.
Thank you, Congressman. I would just close with 3 points. The first is to advise members of Congress to be wary that as much as you might want to draw a bright line between targeted economic sanctions and more comprehensive embargoes, as I said in my testimony, I think the fact is that the economic effects tend to be a little blurrier than the intent. That sometimes targeted sanctions, even if they're designed to be precise, often have penumbras of effect that are unanticipated and need to be considered. This would lead to be my 2 recommendations that I would make. The first is that I do think either the State Department or perhaps the GAO should be required to do sanctions impact assessments. Not before sanctions can be imposed, because I think that's an unrealistic goal, to be fair, but on an annual basis, trying to assess not just the likelihood that sanctions work, but also what are the actual real economic effects, not just in terms of cost to the target regime, but also the costs and immiseration of the target population. I think that has to be done on an annual basis, and it's, in some ways, with any sort of problem, knowing is half the battle, and certainly knowing the problem is an important one. And then finally, I would endorse, I believe, a suggestion that Ms. Simon put forward, which is I do think the idea of a global licensing regime for humanitarian groups that can bypass any sanctions that are put in place, or take advantage of carve-outs of any sanctions that are put in place. I think that might lessen the immediate humanitarian impact of any sanctions that are put forward in the future, particularly if those sorts of, those who have the license wind up developing a reputation of being reputable conveyors of humanitarian relief. I think it actually could alleviate some of the sort of short-term dislocations that would happen when sanctions are imposed immediately.
Thank you. I think I got everybody. Well, let me think. Who did I miss?
No, you got off. So
Okay. Let me thank you very much. Look, this has been an important discussion, and look, we're the Human Rights Commission. We're the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, so our primary focus is human rights.
This meeting is being recorded.
It is important that we talk about these things, and that is it working? Is it not? I mean, how do we do this better? And if we impose a sanctions regime and it's having the opposite effect, we ought to have the maturity to be able to admit it and to change course, which is something that Congress doesn't do very well. People don't like to ever admit they ever make mistakes. And so sometimes we stick with things that are not working for a very, very, very long time. But there are bad regimes in this world, and there ought to be consequences for that bad behavior, especially when they abuse their people, especially when they take they violate religious freedoms, or they target women, or target people for whatever reason. But again, the goal ought to be to hold the government accountable, to have consequences for the people who are responsible for these terrible policies, and not to punish people who are, oftentimes the victims, of the bad government to begin with. So, you're giving us lots to think about, and I appreciate it. And we may be in touch with you about some follow-up, but I really appreciate your time and your insight, and thank you very much. This hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.